I'm Cheryl Sukup, and I'm the president of Sukup Strategic Solutions. And I have many years of experience leading strategic planning sessions, facilitating the whole process, and board retreats in which we vision for the future and set goals. So I'll start us out with thinking about what are we going to talk about today. What is strategic planning? What do I mean when I say strategic planning? So, strategic planning is a process by which an organization articulates where it wants to be and how it will get there. So, that's what we're really talking about today. And during the process, we'll assess the environment that the organization is operating in, both internal and external. And then everything that we do in strategic planning should flow from the mission. So we're going to affirm any mission statement, vision statement, or value statements that the organization has. In addition, we're going to set goals to achieve the vision. So that's going to be a big part of it. And then defining action steps to implement any strategies that you select to accomplish your goals. And finally, you'll document a written plan. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We have a PowerPoint to share with you today. There we go. And I'm seeing that we have a question here, so I want to make sure that we get all the questions answered. But we're going to do some questions and answers once we get to the end. I've set aside some time for that. But if you do have any questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. Okay, great. So moving on. So strategic planning, we're talking about articulating the future and dividing a path on how you're going to get there. So strategic planning is really a cycle. We want to start with assessing the environment, as I mentioned, and talk about mission and vision. Then after you have your mission and vision affirmed, you're going to dream a little bit and try to figure out what your vision is for the near term. Once you know that, you're going to set goals to get there. And then you're going to select strategies that you're going to use to achieve those goals. Once you selected your strategies, and this is often the work that you next do with staff or in committee, but you define your action steps. Exactly what are you going to do, who is going to do it, and what is the time frame in which it will be done. That's the action steps. You move on to your implementation and measure progress over time. And then after your cycle has come to an end, you're going to start the process all over again. And so at Sukup Strategic Solutions, we recommend that you do strategic planning every 3 years, but that you update your plan once a year. So you measure your progress on a regular basis, bring your results to your board of directors once a year, update anything in the plan that you need to, and then go through a full cycle, an entire process that we're going to talk about today. Whatever your process is, you repeat it once every 3 years. A lot of strategic planning used to be done over a 5-year planning cycle, and that's appropriate for some organizations. But with an organization that is either rapidly growing or changing, or an environment that is changing, and most of us are operating in a rapidly changing environment. So much has changed with what's happened in the world around us that planning for a longer time period doesn't always make sense. So we're currently recommending 3 years. So why plan? We recommend 5 key reasons to consider for planning. So some people say to us, we're doing strategic planning because our largest funder said that we should. They really, like, we have a donor or we have a grant funder that says, where's your strategic plan? That is not the reason why we recommend strategic planning. There are much better reasons for strategic planning. Another thing we often hear is because we have to go through reaccreditation, we don't have a strategic plan. Strategic planning for its own sake is really important. It brings so much value to your organization. So 5 key reasons are to encourage your leaders in the organization to look at the big picture. I mean, take time to um, to really dream and to create a shared vision together. When you have a shared vision, it's so much easier to go out to the world at large and encourage people to support you. When people understand where you're going, they're much more likely to come alongside you. And to really be focused on the things that matter the most, which, really for every nonprofit is the impact that you're having. You have to really understand what that bigger picture vision is and where the areas of focus should be. So, um, creating that shared vision and creating a path forward to get there, those are important things in and of themselves. But one other reason is to create a framework for decision making. So a lot of times you'll have a board that wants to delegate to the executive director, but they also want to put guidelines in place. A strategic plan provides that set of guidelines in addition to policies. When you're thinking big picture and the board comes together and there's consensus about where you're going and generally what is most important to focus on, it gives the executive a lot of freedom to be able to move forward within those guidelines, within that structure, and execute on the plan to be able to make great things happen in the organization. Everyone is aligned in the organization when you have a strategic vision that is shared by all of the leaders and the executive and the board. So when you're making decisions, you're going to be making some really big decisions during the strategic planning process. But after the strategic planning process, it also gives that structure to be able to make those additional decisions as you go along over the next 3 years. Every time you're making a major decision for the organization, the executive or the board or both can say, is this in alignment with our strategic plan? The strategic plan also helps you to focus on your impact. As I mentioned, this is important for all of us. We are utilizing resources from the community as stewards, and as such, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing in our nonprofit is really impactful. It's making a difference. So, strategic planning helps you think about what is most important and helps you allocate the resources to what really is going to make the most impact in your organization. So who should be involved in strategic planning? This varies from organization to organization, but our recommendation is that you should have a variety of stakeholders involved in your strategic planning. We've come across organizations where the executive director has come into the job and they have created a strategic plan by themselves and started to work on it. Sometimes it gets shared with the board and sometimes not. We've also had boards who have made strategic plans and given them to their executive directors. We don't recommend that either. We've had organizations that have developed strategic plans with the executive director and with the board, but didn't involve any other stakeholders in any way. We recommend that you involve stakeholders in the process. You can do that formally or informally, but we think that having stakeholders be a part of helping you plan for what's most important in your organization's future is, a really good way to ensure that everyone is being heard, they're part of the process, and that the board can make really good decisions along with the executive to fully meet the needs of the community in alignment with the mission and the vision of the organization. But it's important to hear from the stakeholders that are impacted by the work that's being done. So some of those stakeholders are staff members. So often we'll do employee surveys or at least review some of the data from employee surveys in the process of planning for a retreat in which the board will make decisions. We'll often do the same for clients. Sometimes we'll hold stakeholder meetings or focus groups. Same with volunteers and donors. And so thinking about other key stakeholders that you might have, there might be strategic partners that you want to involve. Sometimes we will interview a strategic partner that works with an organization to understand their point of view on the organization's activities and the importance of their mission to the organization and how the two organizations align. So these are important things to consider when doing your strategic planning, involving a variety of different partners and stakeholders. So we look at strategic planning as 10 basic steps, and I'm going to walk you through each of them. So the first is assessment. So we do an organizational assessment when we do strategic planning. Um, and so you can do organizational assessments or assess the environment in a number of different ways, but we always look at both the internal environment and the external environment. So, one way you can do that is through a situational analysis called a SWOT, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If you're going to do a full organizational assessment, it takes time and there's a lot of data to look at. If you don't have as much time, or your organization is smaller, maybe you don't have as much data, you can do sort of a mini org assessment. But it's important to really think about both internal and external factors that might influence your organization's operations and the success that you can have. Um, so some of the things that you might want to talk about or think about within your organization as you're getting ready to set your goals and your strategy would be the history and, as I mentioned before, the mission, vision, and value statements of the organization. We want to be looking at your programmatic activities. What do you do to accomplish your mission? How is that being done? Are there any reports or assessments? Is there a monitoring agency that works with you that's evaluated your performance? Do you have internal performance reviews and data that you can look at? Do you have any kind of client surveys or mechanisms whereby clients give you feedback? That's another good thing to be considering. Um, we also look at leadership. We ask boards to do a self-assessment, like a self-assessment of their own performance. And there are lots of tools out there that you can use for that, but giving the board an opportunity to do a self-assessment will help ensure that they understand where they're performing really well and where they might need to set some goals for themselves. Um, and then personnel, we always look at personnel. And when we think about human resources, we think about both staff and volunteers. So we try to gather data about both and take a look at trends over the years as well as satisfaction data. And then just thoughts and ideas that they have about the future. We do often try to gather input from them about things that they'd like to see happen within the organization. We also look at finances, and when we do this, we're looking for trends in finances and then talking with folks within the organization about anticipated changes that may be coming in the future. And then we look at past strategic planning efforts. If a strategic plan has been done in the past, we look at the results of that plan and how that plan was structured and the type of planning process that the organization went through, so that you can really think about how much progress has been made, whether or not the last process was effective for the organization, and if progress wasn't made as quickly or as much as was expected, what are some of the reasons for that? We do a little exploration around that. So when you think about an external scan, some of the things that we think about are uh, political, economic, social, technological, and legal and environmental aspects. So when we think about those as a group, we call it PESTLE. So there's a little acronym for that. But there's a lot of things that affect the nonprofit that the nonprofit really doesn't have any control over. So in Southwest Florida, one big thing that we have to contend with are hurricanes. That's an environmental aspect that we have no control over. We can plan for it and prepare for it, and we can recover from it, but we don't have the ability to control whether or not it happens. So that's like an external factor. Some of the internal factors, and I should say, we also will often look at competitive considerations. So who else is in the marketplace, and what else are they doing? What are they doing? Are they competing for donors? Are they competing for contracts with in the same space with the same entities? Are they competing for uh, program participants? Are they doing similar types of work? Are they competing for media attention? What are those considerations? Volunteers, staff members, that's come up a lot in, at least in South. I know we have a lot of Southwest Florida people here today, but recruitment of employees has been a big issue, recruitment and retention, and that competition is a big deal. And then also, we'll often do a community needs assessment if the need has not been well defined, or if there are changes that have happened that require that. So then when we're thinking about internal, we're thinking about things like I talked about. And when we start with our SWOT analysis, we're really starting with internal. We're starting with strengths. So strengths are things that you want to build on. So when you're doing your strategic planning and you're setting goals and you're thinking about the future, it's best to start with things that you're really good at, things that you're making real progress with, and where you have a natural ability to excel. And so defining that is really important. And we usually do that at a board retreat, but we do ask questions of a variety of stakeholders ahead of time so that we can better understand where the strengths lie. We also use that org assessment to do that as well. So the next thing that we talk about is external, which is I'm sorry, internal as well as weaknesses. So weaknesses are things that you'd like to be able to um, address if necessary, if these weaknesses are causing barriers to you succeeding. And if you had a previous strategic planning and you're not achieving your goals, this might be an area that needs to be addressed in order for you to be able to make the progress that you want to make. So weaknesses are good to identify, although it's not something that you want to make your main focus. Really focusing on the strengths is better. Opportunities that's usually a big part of what we discuss in the retreat, are what are the opportunities that you see before you in the next few years that you'd like to be able to take advantage of. And that's really talking about the future. What could you be doing, and what is most likely to bring you more ability to accomplish your mission coming forward in the future. For some organizations, when they go to strategic planning, they're actually looking to address critical issues, and they may come out of strategic planning to merge with another organization. So sometimes you go into strategic planning with growth in mind. Other times you go into strategic planning after a crisis, and you may come out of it not achieving more mission, but deciding how you can best utilize your resources for the good of the community through a merger. So that's possible at times. So anyway, usually opportunities are related to growth and improvement and enhancement of the mission. So threats is another thing that is external. Opportunities and threats both represent external factors, and threats might be, as I mentioned, like a hurricane, but it also could be things like a very competitive fundraising environment in which it's very difficult to maintain donor relations and donor focus on your organization's mission. It could be an aging donor population that you're not prepared for the next stage. So that's something that comes up often. I think but that also there's also opportunity there in the transfer of wealth. So there's sometimes strengths lead to opportunities, but sometimes opportunities and weaknesses also have like a flip side to one another. So we discuss all of that in a retreat where people can consider all of these things together. All right. So, I mean, I think the most important thing about strategic planning is that your mission and your vision are aligned with your plan for moving forward. So, really thinking about strategic planning as a process, it is a means to an end. It's a means to fulfilling the mission and vision. So, as I mentioned earlier, starting with the mission and vision, everything should flow from that. So during strategic planning and often at the retreat, but sometimes in committee beforehand, um, we'll review the mission statement and determine whether or not it needs to be addressed. Is with some of the questions that we ask, like is your mission still relevant? Are these words continuing to describe why you exist, the purpose for your organization to be working in the community? Have you experienced any mission drift in the last several years? Um, and is there a better, more concise way to talk about what you do? Sometimes words that we use um, in one decade are no longer resonating with people in a future decade, and that may be a reason to update your mission statement. Um, we always review at the time of strategic planning whether or not the organization has their mission statement represented in different ways across different communication channels. We'll sometimes find that the way that the mission statement appears on the website is not the same as it appears on brochures, is not the same as how it appears in grant applications, just as an example. So we try to get the leadership to identify, is there a reason why you keep representing your mission statement in a different way? We also ask, is it easy for your board members, your staff members, your volunteers, and your executive to state out in the community? Is it something that rolls off your tongue, or is it 3 or 4 sentences? When it's very long, we ask them to consider creating a separate mission statement and purpose statement. So your organization might have a very brief, easy to say, concise, easy to remember mission statement that people can remember and will resonate with donors, supporters, volunteers, and the community at large. That really make people understand quickly what your organization is about. And then create a longer purpose statement that allows you to say all the other things that you want to say about why you exist. So that can be helpful for some organizations. Then we look at the vision statement, and a lot of vision statements are not really vision statements. They're mission statements restated in a different way. So we ask if it's not really a true vision statement, we'll ask the leaders of the organization to consider, what would the world look like if we have fulfilled our mission? And another way of thinking about it is, what would we say if our organization was no longer needed because we had done our job so well? If all we have to do is maintain the status quo, what would the statement be? So we consider whether or not the vision statement needs to be revised. If it does, then that's work to be done as part of strategic planning. When we're doing strategic planning, as I mentioned, we do an org assessment. We get ready to come together as a group, and then usually the board and sometimes staff, sometimes others. There are times where we do strategic planning with stakeholders present for at least for part of it as well. But definitely the board. The board must be involved in a nonprofit, and so when they come together, we usually do that as a 1 day retreat or a part day retreat. And they're really coming together at a time where they can have bigger picture thinking, that they're able to dream, that they're able to come together and create that shared vision. They brainstorm together about what the organization looks like in their mind's eye. And so we use lots of words and phrases to try to come up with what that organization looks like in the future. In some cases, we even draw pictures of it and try to get them in small groups to reveal in words and phrases or other ways how that organization looks, feels, what it's doing, what it's accomplishing, and what it's like to be a part of that organization. So this gives you an opportunity to really dream and think big. We tell them, there's no wrong answer here. This is just what you'd like it to be. We'll talk about more We'll talk about more specific feasible things as we move forward, but we want to get it out all on the table. So, um, when an organization really needs to think longer term to be able to do this dreaming, because some organizations have never done this and they need to think much further into the future in order to really get this out. You can switch gears and say, well, let's talk about 10 years into the future or 20 years into the future when you may no longer be involved. And that sometimes can help them get longer term, think bigger picture. If you need to do that, then you should, because where we really want to be is thinking 50,000 feet in the air and far into the future, not what's going to happen next week, next month, or next year, but really, what does the organization look like when you're really fully fulfilling your mission? And then you can start setting goals for what it's going to look like 3 years from now. Once you figure out what you want it to be like far into the future, then you can figure out what you need to do in the next few years to get there. So that's when you start setting goals. And I think a lot of times when you think about the organization and what it looks like far into the future, and then what it needs to be, what it needs to have accomplished 3 years from now in order to really be able to um, then 10 years from now look like that organization that you're dreaming of. The way to get to accomplish what you need to in the next 3 years is to set goals with measurable objectives and then figure out how are we going to achieve those goals. So when you're setting goals and you're thinking strategically about a an over, like sometimes you'll think about overall strategy for the organization, so there may be one really overarching thing that you're going to try to do. So an example would be an organization we recently did strategic planning with. um, their big thing was they know what they want to do about 5 years from now. But in order to get there in the next few years, they really need to build capacity. There are a lot of things that they know that they have put off and they haven't done. And they're nearing the place where they will really be able to take off as an organization. In order to be able to do that, they know that there are several things that they need to be able to do in the areas of fundraising, in marketing, in human resources, and in governance to prepare them for that. So their strategic plan is really, their strategy is really to strengthen the core components of the organization to prepare to take off, because they know that they want to expand and they know they have the ability to do it. They just need to kind of strengthen the core to be able to accomplish what they know is coming. That's a strategy in and of itself, is to step back, strengthen the core, and then move forward. So you prioritize what you want to achieve in the next few years. This should be ambitious, but also still realistic. So when we dream these big dreams, it's important to pull it back to what you really can do in the next few years. What's realistic? If you don't know this as an organization, get professional help to help you identify what you really can expect would be reasonable. Because sometimes we've seen organizations set goals that are way too big, and then they don't make the progress. People get frustrated, and then they don't make the progress in really any of the areas. And then they come back to strategic planning again, and they find that they really haven't made very much progress at all. Sometimes there are detrimental things that happen as a result of it as well. An example would be um, we've seen some smaller organizations where they are so focused on programs and wanting to grow the programs, and they become really ambitious about that. We'll tell them that they also have to grow in all of the other areas that support the growth of programs, and particularly in fundraising. Well, sometimes they don't grow in the areas of fundraising. They focus everything on programs, and that imbalance means that their programs grow without the financial support to continue to support their programs, and then they get into a crisis. So nobody wants that to happen in their organization. So it's really important to identify what is realistic and set your goals appropriately and make sure there's balance in growth. If you're growing your programs, you also have to be growing your fundraising at a pace that is appropriate to support that additional program growth. Um, because if you're growing programs, you also need personnel. And if you need personnel, some of them are going to be paid personnel, and you have to have the resources to pay your personnel, put on your programming, and pay for any other inputs that you need in order to create the impact that your mission calls for. So I think ambitious goals are great as long as they're appropriate and realistic. We do set goals in functional areas. So these are the functional areas on the slide. The first is programs. We always lead from the mission, and the mission means the programmatic activities of the organization, whatever your mission-based activities are. The next is human resources. As I mentioned, we often think about staff, employees, but it also includes volunteers, which is a really important component of your human resources for a lot of nonprofits. Many nonprofits have many more volunteers than they have staff. So important to include goal setting related to volunteers. Facilities. Some organizations don't utilize facilities of their own, so this might not be an important area for goal setting, but if you do have facilities or you're planning to develop facilities, they should be a part of your strategic plan if you have strategic moves to make in the area of facilities. Some organizations have many facilities, and facilities just aren't a part of their plan because they're not planning any growth or expansion or renovation. Their facilities are serving their needs and what they want to do programmatically in their strategic plan does not require any changes to facilities. So you just wouldn't include that in your strategic planning process. You might consider it, but you're not going to necessarily set goals in that area. Fundraising for fundraising organizations, charities that depend on philanthropy, fundraising should always be part of your strategic goals. And then your marketing supports your fundraising. Marketing can also support other things that you do. If you're an advocacy organization, marketing and communications are a big part of how you do your work, your programmatic mission-based work. So marketing would also support that. Marketing can also help you with outreach to bring new people in to be a part of your mission, not just as supporters, but maybe as beneficiaries. So marketing and communications is typically part of the plan as well. And for nonprofits, governance. When you do your board performance assessment, when they do their self-evaluation of their own performance, this is often where you get the governance goals from. There are areas usually that the board needs to work on if they're going to achieve or aspire to excellence in governance. Setting goals for themselves will help them to improve, and it should be aligned with what you want to accomplish in your organization. So for instance, if you're going to make a big move forward in fundraising as part of your strategic plan, you want to make sure that your governance goals are in alignment with that. Is your board a fundraising board? Does the board have the connections to help you move forward in fundraising? Do they have the appropriate skills and knowledge to assist? Is your board large enough? So these are different factors to consider. The other thing is, we often encounter organizations that are moving from small organizations that were really more grassroots into professionally managed organizations. And sometimes during that stage, there is a need to address succession of founders. And that's something that often gets addressed in strategic planning through the governance goals. Okay, so some sample goals would be the organization will expand its programs to serve more clients, or the organization will expand its pool of active volunteers. For facilities, it might be, oh, this is not the right one. Develop a definitive plan for building renovation and expansion. Um, for fundraising, the organization will increase its annual um, net income year over year, for instance, or it might be its annual fundraising income. For marketing, the organization will increase brand awareness, and for governance, the board will increase its efficiency. So these are different things that might come up. These are not for every organization, but just some examples. So those are very broad. The way that we set goals and objectives, we use SMART goals, but we break our goals down into objectives and benchmarks. So the difference between the goals and the objectives are that the goals are very broad and overarching, and they state general intentions. It's something that you can share with people out in the community. It's kind of, they're simple and easy to say, and they kind of get the general idea across. They're to some degree abstract, and they're often difficult to measure if you don't have objectives and benchmarks. So that's what we use objectives and benchmarks for. Objectives are more narrow and they're very specific. They're precise and tangible, concrete, and measurable. They give you numbers, they give you time frames, and they allow you to measure your progress over time. When we talked about uh, ambitious but feasible goals, what we're really talking about are attainable goals, things that you can attain. So when we're talking about attainability of goals, that's something that we are considering at the goal setting stage. When you're talking about measurable, you're talking about objectives. And so here's some sample objectives. So for a human resource goal of the organization will expand its pool of active volunteers, the objectives could be something like at least 80% of existing volunteers will provide service in the 12 months ending blah, blah, blah. So the idea here is if you've looked through your organizational assessment and you've determined that some of you have a large volume of volunteers, but they're not all engaged in service, and that is an issue, and you see an opportunity to involve more volunteers, you have work for them to do, and they can help you succeed in achieving some of your other strategic goals, then maybe one of the goals that you set is to increase the number of existing volunteers that are active in service. So that's just an example of how you might come to a goal like that. The next one is the organization will enroll at least 60 new volunteers by such and such a date. So you can see that we're trying to put numbers, percentages, and a time frame so that these are measurable things. But they're all tied back to something that is strategic in nature. Oftentimes, one goal helps you achieve another goal, or one objective helps you achieve another objective. The goals are really set to complement one another. But being able to define very specifically what you're going to achieve, that helps you measure your progress over time. So I mentioned SMART goals and objectives. So many of you may have heard specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals. We set our goals with objectives and benchmarks to make those goals SMART goals, while still being able to deliver to the board and the community at large a set of goals that are very easy to understand, that are more generalized in nature than people who are really looking to achieve those goals, or organizations that might be funding our efforts. They'll be able to see the measurable part of our goals and the progress that we make over time. So when you're thinking about many different strategies that you might use to achieve your goals, you're going to want to select those that make the best use of your resources to accomplish the goals. And you're really going to use strategic thinking to determine this. So you're going to be reviewing possible strategies And we do this at the retreat. Usually, when we're talking about goal setting, we're talking about how we might achieve these goals. So we don't take them out of thin air. We think about what we learned in the organizational assessment. We think about where the organization is today and where you want to be in the future. Where you want to be in the future is really helps you determine what your goals are. And then how you get there, you have to think about how you get from where you are today, point A, to where you want to be, point B, and start having some dialogue about how you get there. What are those strategies that might help you succeed? So in the example of the volunteerism, if you have found that you have many volunteers that have signed up to work with you and you've been communicating with them, you can see that they're reading your emails, but they just are not engaged in service. You can start looking at, okay, well, we have all these things that we want to be able to do. One of the strategies that we're going to use is to better utilize a volunteer workforce. And that's going to be an overarching strategy for us, is to engage people in service and deploy them to help us achieve our programmatic goals or our fundraising goals or whatever other goals that you have. So thinking about that as a strategy to use, you have certain goals around volunteers that you want to achieve to help you achieve the rest of it. And then when you think about using strategies to be able to achieve your volunteer goals, we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So as I mentioned, we do break things up into benchmarks. So our objectives, each objective also has benchmarks that help you break that objective into smaller chunks, usually smaller quantities or a smaller amount of time. This helps you to continue to measure your progress over time in shorter increments. So the benefit of doing this is really that you're able to course correct sooner. If you are not making progress, you don't want to wait until a year goes by. You want to, or 3 years goes by. You really want to be able to say, okay, we're not making progress in this one particular area. We want to try to switch gears, try a different strategy to achieve that and see if that works better for us. But what we're doing is not working, so we want to switch gears. Here would be an example. Going back to the human resource goal of the organization will expand its pool of active volunteers. And the objective that I just shared with you, as an example, the organization will enroll at least 60 new volunteers by June 30th, 2025. The first benchmark is at least 20 new volunteers will be enrolled by December 31st, 2024. And we put here how we know this, as evidenced by volunteer enrollment forms. Benchmark 122, at least 40 new volunteers will be enrolled by March 31st, 2025. Again, as evidenced by volunteer enrollment forms. And then for benchmark 123, at least 60 new volunteers will be enrolled by June 30th, 2025. And that's the end date of the objective. So you have 3 different benchmarks that break down not only the time frame, but also how many new volunteers will be enrolled in each of those time frames. It breaks it up into smaller chunks so that by December 31st of 2024, if you haven't recruited and enrolled at least 20 new volunteers, then you know that you're not going to likely meet your target for the whole objective by the end of June 30th, 2025. So it's time to think about what else you might do instead of what you have been doing. So as I was talking about defining strategies, I think you want to be thinking about all of the different resources that you have available to you and what is realistic for you to utilize as a strategy, so that the impact that you want to have is going to be realized. You want to really talk and have dialogue about this and really think about what ideas people have based on some of the opportunities that you identified in your SWOT. And think about how you might go about achieving the goal using either resources that you currently have, strengths your organization has, and then opportunities that are available to you. So you're going to evaluate all the possibilities, select the ones that make the most sense for you, and put those into your plan. Here's some sample strategies for the example that we've been talking about. So the organization will enroll at least 60 new volunteers by June 30th, 2025. To achieve that objective, maybe a couple of things that you might do would be decrease the lag time between a volunteer's first contact with the organization and the date the enrollment process is initiated. Why might you come up with this? Maybe during strategic planning, before the retreat, you had in your org assessment talked with a group of volunteers, held a stakeholder meeting, or did a survey, or had individual interviews with some key volunteers to learn more about what was working and what wasn't working. Maybe people told you that, the first contact from the organization is like, they have to wait a really long time for somebody to get in touch with them and get them ready to go. And by the time somebody contacted me, I was already doing something else. So you might find out, from some volunteers that their friends tried to enroll, or their neighbors or their family members, and that they had a poor experience. Being able to address that as a strategy, saying we're really going to focus in on that initial experience with us and make sure we convert them from interested party into enrolled volunteer very, very quickly. And then, another example is here. You'll all get access to these slides if you'd like them. So I'll just move on from there. But you hopefully get the drift that you can get more specific when you start looking at strategies to achieve objectives. Maybe you have an overarching strategy of we're going to build our volunteer base, but and engage volunteers in service to help us uh, achieve some of our programmatic goals. But when you get down into the nitty gritty, you really have to think about how might you solve that problem or achieve that goal. So action steps, that's the next piece. And we usually don't do action steps, we don't get into the details at this level until the board has approved the plan. So usually we go through a whole strategic planning process where we do your org assessment. We're getting all of the pieces into place. We have the board retreat. The board comes together, affirms the mission, vision, and value statements. They have a chance to talk about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. They have a chance to dream together and create a big vision for the future, which is different from your vision statement, but it's a vision for the future. Say 5 or 10 years from now, maybe 20, if they have a really hard time visioning. And then they will set their goals. Once they have their goals and their objectives set, usually we don't even get into the benchmarks there. Some smaller group of people, whether that's us with an executive or a committee of the board, like the strategic planning committee, then the details get filled in for objectives and benchmarks. But if the board can come to a place where they've identified their goals, they've identified some of the strategies, they've defined enough information about how far they want to get by year 3 that we can start doing, putting together the objectives and the benchmarks, then we leave the retreat and then we go develop that written plan. Then we bring the plan back to the board. And generally, we don't get into the weeds with them with benchmarks. Some boards like to see that, so we'll share that when they want that. But the executive always receives that, the board chair receives that, and if there's a strategic planning committee, they receive it and they work on that. They work on that together with us. So there really should be in your organization a smaller group that is really looking at the details, making sure that the details make sense for your organization, and then keep the board at a higher level. Those that are more interested and they want to dig deeper into the weeds, then they should be on the committee. So you need to give them enough information so that what you are planning makes sense to them and they can approve it feel like they're making an informed decision. But they shouldn't get so in the weeds that, they're, I don't know, missing the forest for the trees, if you know what I mean. So getting into the details can be just bad news at the board level. You want them to stay high level, you want them to stay strategic, you want them to feel excited and invigorated about the plan. You want them to feel like their plan is going to allow the whole organization to achieve their shared vision, and you want them to be excited to go out and share that with others in the community. So thinking about what's going to happen, I'm going to skip over action steps because it's really going to, I mean, you're going to take action steps either to a member of either a member of the staff or to a committee. So it's not something that really you need to, you need to worry about at the board level, but this is the work of the staff or committee that is going to be taking the lead on a particular objective. So as I mentioned, you document and adopt the plan. A big piece of that is once the plan has been adopted, then the board can allocate resources to achieve that plan. So it helps for decision making in budgeting. And then you begin your implementation. You're going to create strategic implementation teams. That might be committees of the board. It could be small teams within the staff, or even staff and volunteers. But you're going to assign work to people according to those action plans that you're developing. It's important that you carve out time. So a lot of times we'll do an operational plan alongside the strategic plan that defines how the strategic goals get incorporated into the day-to-day work of the organization for a 1-year period. What out of the strategic goals are you going to accomplish this year? Which benchmarks are you going to work on this year, and make sure that it stays in the forefront of people's minds? You're going to report on progress at regular intervals, and if things are not working, you're going to course correct before it becomes too late. Now, there's various variations in strategic planning, so it's important that you find the right fit for yourself. I've described a process that we use, but there's lots of different ways that you can do strategic planning. I do not recommend that one person sit down and do it by themselves. I do recommend that you involve a variety of stakeholders, but there are a lot of good plans. The most important thing is that you start with your mission and your vision, that you take time to dream, and that your goals and objectives are measurable. From there, create an action plan and don't leave your plan on a shelf. They say a lot of strategic plans end up on the shelf, gathering dust. The way to prevent that is to make sure that you are measuring progress, and there's accountability to the board, that the board is expecting to hear a report come to them on a regular basis, whether that's quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. So with that, I would like to answer any questions. So let's just see, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to share? Let's see if I can see any questions in the questions and answers. I don't see any questions. Anybody have anything that you'd like to ask? A good board assessment tool. So their board source has a really great assessment tool. So if that's something that you need, board source creates one that you can buy off the shelf. Our team also does board assessments, and they're really simple surveys that you can send out. And really, honestly, a board assessment doesn't take much time at all. Our surveys that go out, we send them 2 surveys. One that is it helps them measure their own performance, and then a second survey helps them reflect on the performance of the board as a whole. And so each one takes like 7 minutes. So the total amount of investment of time that board members take to do these is 15 minutes. And then you can incorporate discussion about this in your board meetings. Board Source has like a really comprehensive tool, and then they have a smaller list of questions that you can use and put into a survey yourself as well. Any other questions? So we're a small group, no staff, just volunteer board, and our organization's main program is no longer an option for us to pursue. Some folks on the board are unaware. How would you start this difficult conversation? Ooh, that's a big conversation. So I'm gonna I'm gonna say I'd be happy to talk to you about this on the side and give you some tips. So if you want to go to our website and just click schedule a consultation, I'm happy to talk to you about it. No charge, just spend a little bit of time with me and I'll answer your question. You're so welcome. Anybody else have any questions? You're so welcome, Nina. Thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it today. How do you address the resistance of boards to getting into strategic planning? So, okay, this last slide is about creating buy-in. So I think, one of the biggest things is that if a board really understands their role, then they're more likely to engage in strategic planning. It is one of the most important things that a board can do. If there's anything that they want to be able to accomplish, especially as a new board chair comes in, having a conversation between the board chair and the executive, also when a new executive comes in, having that conversation about what do you want to achieve. That is a great thing to be able to talk to a new person as as somebody is transitioning into the position. And that's a good time to start that conversation about strategic planning. I think also, another, like, I hate to say it, but a lot of organizations come to us because their board agreed to strategic planning only because it was required in an accreditation or is required by a grant funder or a donor asked for it when they were asking for a gift. So when those things happen, those are things that start to help a board understand the importance. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about that on the side too. So it's same thing. If you want to just have a side conversation, I'm happy. So logic models. So we have a whole training on logic models, and actually we're going to do a webinar on that later this year. So feel free to join us on that. But logic models are another tool that you can use. They often are used to describe the impact that you're going to have in a program and how you're going to get there. So they also can be used to define what's going to happen in your operational plan. So stay tuned. We're going to do a webinar on logic models. How long does the strategic planning process take? Approximately weeks or months. So most strategic planning processes, when you're involving a board, it usually does take months, because while it can be very quick to do a survey for the board's performance evaluation, and it can take time to get them um, to do the org assessment and gather all the information and data. Even if that goes quickly, sometimes it can be hard to get the board to get together and dedicate the time for a retreat. So the board is usually the limiting factor time-wise. It usually takes, the longer it takes for the board to do their part, the longer it's going to take for the strategic planning. But I mean, the work itself isn't that many hours. So we usually estimate anywhere from about 20 hours all the way up to like 75 hours for strategic planning, depending on the size of the organization and the complexity. That's not that much time. I mean, you can do 20 hours in 1 week if you had the cooperation of the entire board. So, and thank you for your comment about it being informative. And yes, we will send a copy of the presentation out to everybody that participated today. And the retreat it's not the beginning of the process of planning. The beginning of the process of planning starts with your organizational assessment. The retreat is really the beginning of putting the plan itself together and developing the goals. The development of the objectives and benchmarks usually comes after the retreat, and then the written plan going to the board for approval is the end of the planning process and the start of the implementation process. Thank you, Amy. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. All right, if you have any other questions, please send an email and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions. And please feel free to schedule some time with me by just clicking on the link on our website. for a free consultation. I'll be happy to talk to you more about this webinar and answer any additional questions. So thank you very much for your time today.